So is that moment? Yeah.
Well, can I introduce you?
Yes, please.
Yes, sorry, that's actually my job. Welcome to KAPiTAL and to our talk tonight. We have invited Alex because he's just published his new book, Ricochet. The epigenetics.
We don't have it's finished.
Can I take something? Sorry.
Lemonade?
Yes.
Alright.
When did it come out?
So it came out 2 weeks ago. It came to Berlin 2 weeks ago.
So it's brand new. And
Yeah.
you get to tell us about it.
Indeed, it's brand new, and it has been a 4-year process. I guess at the top, I just want to say thanks to Ljå Forlag in Oslo, thanks to Jørn Aargaard, thanks to everyone that contributed to the work, which has involved consultations with people. It's involved specific knowledge being shared, particularly sort of certain archives that were made available, but also thanks to all the photographers and to everyone that's basically just dealt with me being a hermit in these otherwise hermetic times. Yeah, it's been a 4-year process, 2 years of researching and 2 years of sort of writing and completion. But there have been questions in this work that I've been asking for a much longer period. It's kind of produced a fair volume of information, which I'm obviously not going to try and cover all of this evening. Rather, I will begin part of the archaeological narrative, which structures my theory of cultural epigenetics. Then I will kind of go into some detail about the history of the sacred date palm tree. We can then have a few questions if anyone wants. Also, people on the stream, I think you're able to ask questions through the chat, and I think that's possible. And then I will do a reading for about 40 minutes, and if there are questions after that, we can also go there. So, Ricochet, Cultural Epigenetics and the Philosophy of Change. I will begin at chapter 3, which is exploring the germline of the Corinthian order. Thank you all for coming, thank you all for being here. When I began researching this work, I believed that plants were the guardians of a secret knowledge. I believe that communication in plants was key to understanding not only the origins of life, but also the epistemological root of consciousness itself, the so-called big problem for neurobiologists and philosophers more widely. And indeed, plants truly are the origin story of life on planet Earth, of all simple and complex organisms such as ourselves. The quest for an origin story is also surely as old as time. So what would be new about this one? I believed that this time, against all the odds, that the truth to the archetype of the Garden of Paradise would be revealed. I must have been high, right? To muster up the confidence, the sheer arrogance to begin the Sisyphean task. Or bored perhaps, or frustrated. I'm certainly neither the first nor the last to pose these questions. In the chiseled English voice of the EasyJet onboard announcer. I have to remember how to do this now. When I wrote it, I didn't realize I was going to have to actually conjure up that voice, but I guess I'll give it a shot. Sort of put yourself back in that seat, you know, the slight nerves.
EasyJet.
Belt, you know, EasyJet, so it's not the worst. To the extent that I've produced an investigation into human origins, this work now feels like a kind of sense-making ritual. Beautiful. We're with you. Let's do this. An echo of other superstructures that keep the individual and the community, body and soul, bound together. In each phase of the research, I've taken nothing at face value, but continually asked questions of the data. But alas, to no avail. The origins of consciousness have eluded me. I've failed to define the meaning of my subject, either when written in ceramic, stone, or ink. The physical location of the garden remains a mystery. No glitch in the matrix shall be mine after all. I realize now that in the early years of preparing to write this work, I had become obsessed quite beyond the realm of manic productivity. I drank from great pools of heady wine until my head broke the surface and I became submerged entirely. The work I have undertaken here to discover the origins of life and/or consciousness can appropriately be referred to as an intoxicant, because so many of the seers and mystics who claim to possess this kind of knowledge enter altered states in order to uncover it. My most coveted object of inquiry, the jewel in the colonial crown, if you will, is quite literally the swirling leaves upon an architectural facade, a simulacrum, a surfaced impression. A buffer like the Dutch courage in my veins, this obsession served as a little nip to make me stronger as I wandered through the research. From where I'm standing now, it's fairly easy to view it all as a phallic obsession with tall columns. As a child of the 90s, the spectacular tragedy of September the 11th really did resonate. Tall columns became a pathway to many other such archetypes presented in classical and neoclassical architecture. Phoenixes, third eyes, trees, wombs, and portals. So I'm going to sort of break the form a little bit to share what I discovered. The kind of tall columns that I was obsessed with really shortly after, maybe somewhere in the sort of early 2000s, I became fixated in the leaves on the Corinthian order of the top Corinthian column of the Corinthian order. So the very kind of pinnacle of this classical architecture contains flowers and sort of decorative forms taken from nature. And I basically just assumed that they were tied up to do with something to do with the Garden of Paradise, with the Garden of Eden, but clearly could see that these forms came into being prior to the formulation of the Bible, for example. And also, as you go further back, you can see that crowning columns with plant motifs is something which was not new when the Greeks began doing it. Nonetheless, I went through the world, as you do, and just sort of always had that as a question in the back of my mind. So, as a kind of like forensic analysis of these architectural forms, you have these are called volutes, these kind of swirling aspects. This is a palmette in the middle, and these are acanthus leaves. And so it transpires that there is an episteme to this architecture actually 10,000 years prior to the Greek expression. So these are these forms come into being, the oldest one, this is a drawing of the very oldest one, around 300 BCE in Corinth, as you may have guessed. This expression is from 10,000 BCE. It's from a book called The Sacred Date Palm Tree by a man called Danthine, which was published in 1935 in Paris. And it took me a very long time to find this. And on the way, I sort of encountered and researched many different versions of floral motifs crowning columns within architecture. And it took me a long time to get to this form because there have been historians that have always located it in the Greek period. But before I get into that, I was talking about wombs, I was talking about phoenixes, I was talking about all these sort of mystical things. And so I'd like to sort of break open that architecture a little bit and refer to some of the other kind of hidden elements within it. So what one finds is that there is particular emphasis on this kind of central area of the form itself. And this one can locate back to the palm leaf here. These are in fact representations of the dates. So the sacred date palm tree is very important. It's not just any old palm tree. The fridge, as we learned earlier, is incredibly passionate on this subject. But what I also found was that this kind of central kind of parmet can also be another form, which contains another type of story. These images in the center here are from the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. I took these with a zoom, and you can see this kind of semi-worm-like shape that is sort of half one thing, half another. It could be a bulb, it could be something like very, very plant-like. But in other expressions, for example, the one here from the Church of St. Sulpice in Paris reveals that it's actually a worm. And there are many other places where those worm motifs are very explicit. And the mythology behind the worm is that when the phoenix burns out every 400 years or every 100 years, depending on which interpretation you're using, drawing on, it leaves this worm behind in its nest. And so this worm will then become the new phoenix. And that resonates with a lot of the mythology and religious thinking, which we would now call pagan, but which ultimately tells a story of life, death, and rebirth. And there are many mythological structures which use that cycle to elaborate on perhaps our place on this earth during the time that we're alive, and also the great kind of mythical superstructures of the time, the classic example being the myth of Isis and Osiris, who is reborn through Horus and starts the whole Egyptian royal lineage. But that's only in sort of the third millennia, fourth to third millennia, and actually what one finds is that there's a huge proliferation of sacred palm trees that precede even the Egyptian canon. So to go back in again, to zone back in again on the Corinthian column as we find it in many, many places, and particularly buildings of power, so libraries, stock exchanges. The New York Stock Exchange has this kind of architecture, many, of course, churches, schools, town halls. This is why I became excited, I guess, about this architecture, because I felt that it was something that was being worn particularly by the architecture of power. These acanthus leaves are given by the Roman historian Vitruvius to be emergent with the beginning of the Corinthian column itself, sculpted by a Greek man named Kallimachos. And as Vitruvius would have us believe, Kallimachos was out walking one day and he found a funerary basket, a kathos, in Corinth. And basically a young woman had died and all of her possessions had been put in the kathos on top of her grave, as was traditional, and a stone placed on top of it. And the acanthus leaf, as you see here in this incredibly typical rendition of the myth or of the story, have grown through the basket. So they've grown through and they've protruded. And in Vitruvius's narrative, that inspired Kallimachos to create the Corinthian sort of crowning version of the whole Corinthian order for the wealthy of Corinth at the time, so around 400 BC. What also has emerged, however, is that there is another myth which has been sort of silenced within classical mythology, and that is to say that the god Apollo, who is a very important god for the ancient Greeks, he was the god of archery and fertility, but also of Greece. He was the national myth character of Greece itself. And so he is a very prominent character within Greek mythology. He had a nymph named Acantha. Acantha was, essentially there to do his bidding, but she rejected his advances and scratched his face. And in so doing, enraged Apollo. This is actually Apollo metamorphosizing Daphne into a laurel bush, but he also metamorphosed Acantha for scratching his face into the acanthus plant. So the acanthus has the spikes. But that myth is not found in huge libraries of terminology for the Greeks, but it is found in certain encyclopedias. So there's a certain kind of silencing that's taking place there of a rebellious woman. So this may be that this is the first image of a acantha being metamorphosized into the acanthus plant. So what one finds then is that there are two forms of cultural silencing that are taking place here. There is the palm tree at the very origin, and there is acantha later on. And as you look around, one discovers, if you become obsessive, that there are in fact little palmettes and sacred palms that penetrate really the culture of many, many different sort of sacred sites. So this is obviously the Statue of Liberty. This is prior to its construction in New York. And I don't know if you can see it, definitely it's a push on the stream, but these are little palmettes. So, you would never be expected to see that, but of course certain people know that it's there. And that's characteristic of the way in which secret societies and Masons communicate and don't communicate through through the architecture that they leave with us. This is also some other pictures that I took with the zoom lens of the Französische Dom, also in Berlin. And you can see upon closer inspection that the Huguenot monk standing on the very, very top of this cathedral church is holding a palm in one hand, and he's stepping on a human skull. So there's a resonance with palms that I think is undeniable. And one, of course, wants to find some sort of logic to this pattern. And I think that's been really what I've tried to do with the idea of cultural epigenetics, and I will get into the biological modeling very shortly. But there is another connection which brings this stuff from 10,000 BCE all the way up to 2016, which we'll get to in a minute. And that kind of intersection is this Baroque church in Brazil, which is from the late 1700s, where one finds, of course, two palms directly oriented in front of the church. And that's interesting because about 4,000 years prior in Syria, in the Fertile Crescent, you have the god Shamash emerging between these two palms. So these are two gods opening up a pathway. So it seems very likely that there is a resonance there with the priests who are building these churches throughout the ages and other sites of sacred worship, and this particular portal, if you like, or this particular passageway, probably to another realm of some kind, through deep meditation, perhaps through fasting. We also know that Mohammed fasted underneath a palm tree, so it's said, and that Muslims break their fast in Ramadan by eating dates. So there is also, again, another resonance there. So what is going on with these palm trees? Because clearly one could say that there is a sort of polyphony of usage. There is a kind of set of novel expressions which are taking place. So these are all ranging between, I guess, the sort of 5th and 3rd millennium, and these are all sort of from the Fertile Crescent. This one would be much earlier, actually. This is around 10 BCE. And so there are all these different expressions, there are all this stuff, all these different things going on. Part of the impetus with writing Ricochet, which I didn't really mention before, but when I started looking at it in 2017, I wasn't really thinking about sacred palm trees at that point. I was thinking about the mutation of the far right. We had, of course, the referendum in the UK, we had the 45th president in the United States, and we had, Le Pen, we had so many things starting to take place, which unfortunately are still gaining momentum now. And I had enjoyed and found the systems theory approach in my first book, Here Comes Trouble. And so I wanted to do something that, instead of using physics, which was what the models which I had used in Here Comes Trouble, I wanted to look at biology. So I started looking at mutation and the far right. So I've been approaching this whole body of research in terms of mutation on the one hand and epigenetics on the other hand. And as of course now has become common parlance, mutation produces a lot of different varieties, a lot of different novel expressions. So for example, one has upwards of 10,000, between 10,000 and 100,000 or mutations from your cells reproducing every hour, every day. And so I sort of started to liken this pattern of different expressions of the sacred date palm to mutations. Most of those mutations in your body, nothing will happen. Eventually one of them may turn to cancer and kill you. But more or less they're lost to history, they're lost to time. And so one finds then this great polyphony of sacred palms, and it really becomes impossible to sort of not see that lineage, I think. But what we also find as this chronology of expressions, this kind of polyphony of expressions goes on, is that regardless of the very varied set of expressions that you find, you always find the sacred palm tree. It always seems to come back. It seems to re-emerge as sites of interest and sites of power over and over again. So for at least the last 12,000 years. Not least at the Secret Service building in Berlin, which was built in 2016. Again, this is a picture I took in, sometime last year. So there are these two modalities which I'm interested in, mutation and epigenetics. And I think now is a good time perhaps to explain a little bit what I mean by epigenetics and how that field of science has become kind of relevant, I would say, but also kind of fits this research in a way that I think is productive, not just as an analogy, but actually I think there is a real crossover between culture and biology, which I want to discuss a little bit. Rather that culture determines biology, obviously, and not the other way around. So, hang on to your seats. So epigenetics is essentially the science of cell memory. So what we have in our bodies when our cells replicate can be either mutations, exact copies, or what are known as epimutations. And those epimutations are basically forms of cell replication which are triggered by the environment. They can be triggered by your diet, they can be triggered by living next to a motorway. They can also be triggered by positive things and you get healthy cell replication. The way in which this is explained in terms of plants, and it functions the same way in humans, is that if you have a tree which flowers in the springtime, then the epigenome, which is basically, this is represented by these chemicals which sit on top of the genes, they will be affected by the temperature of the environment. So for example, if you have a cherry blossom tree, it blossoms, its leaves fall off, it goes into winter. As it goes into the coldness of winter, the epigenome for flowering is switched off. When it begins to warm, when the climate begins to warm again, slowly, cell by cell, the epigenome for flowering is turned back on again. And so eventually it will flower, and so it goes through this cycle. Let me give you some more images of this so that I can explain it a little better. So I've been really lucky to work with Jørn Aargaard on these images, and he's been given this task of trying to create sort of legible and easy to understand images for this stuff, right? So hang on, I can just get this in a more clear way. So this is a kind of scale diagram of how we can observe where the epigenome functions within cell replication. So on the left here, this is the very kind of most zoomed in version you can get of your DNA. So the gene is made up of lots of different strands of DNA. You have these 4 different base pairs, 4 different chemicals, which are represented here by the 4 different colors. When a cell replicates, it basically splits into 2, right? So it has to basically open up, and as it opens, then there is the moment for the chemical epigenome, which sits on top to affect the way in which the cell will replicate. It then bundles itself back up again, and then it goes into the chromosome, so that chromosome would actually split and there will be 2. And this is just a diagram of the different scales. So again here you have an example of like, you know, a diagram really of how that would work. So what we're able to do then is to make arguments that are not only about you know, saying that, okay, well, there's your DNA, you're born with it, you can't change it, that's what you've got to work with. Actually, with epigenetics, what we find is that it's plastic enough that you can influence your epigenome within your own lifetime. And that's kind of interesting to me, because that means that when you're faced with a cultural motif that you've been surrounded with your whole life, and it has kind of, let's say, produced certain meanings, or it's associated with certain types of power, then if that cultural motif actually engenders a traumatic experience in the viewer of that object, and I'm thinking particularly of all of the statues and the monuments which were pulled down and which continue to be removed, then I think there is a strong argument to say that that expression of changing the urban environment, of actually intervening within the landscape of the city itself, is to some extent, I would argue, changing the cultural epigenome for that society. So that raises a lot of questions about what should take place with the rest of this architecture, and the way in which that stuff is constructed, both physically in terms of where the money has come from in order to produce this stuff, but also in terms of the narratives which underpin it. Because there are many aspects, which I'm going to get into when I read from chapter 8, of this architecture which are really supportive of white supremacy, in fact. So that's my sort of thesis of cultural epigenetics, is that effectively culture can determine biology. I would argue that it does determine biology, and that one can see that culture performs in the same way that epigenetics performs within the organism over time, in the same way that culture also performs in a mutational function. It produces many, many different slight variations on itself, but nonetheless comes back to these patterns. So I think that is where I want to kind of put that section of the research at this point. You know, one talks about, for example, silencing and activation within epigenetics, right? So when the cherry blossom tree goes into winter, the epigenome being switched off that would produce the blossoms themselves is referred to as silencing. And I would say that, for example, with the canther being written out of that history is a form of cultural silencing. And of course, what I hope and what I believe is that this research also opens up a lot of discussions and a lot of ways in which to discuss cultural imperialism and cultural hegemony. Because actually, a lot of the time, I don't think that a lot of people which celebrate classical architecture, and particularly this form, are aware of its episteme. I don't think people are aware that this goes back 10,000 years, even at the point of creation, or like being brought into being, apparently. And so I think that encourages and maybe demands a kind of review of that architecture itself. So that's my introductory passage, and if there are any questions now, you're very welcome. I'm open to taking some questions, and then I will do some reading.